When I first began this project and began thinking about a specific leader, my mind raced. And I like the idea of not limiting ourselves on the type of leader that we could focus on, that the traditional definition of a leader could be challenged to some degree. So as I began my research, I did so on my Mac computer. As I would have a quick thought, I would whip out my iPhone, and when those two devices weren't readily available, I would rely on my iPad mini for browsing. So I am an Apple advocate. I am an Apple fan and an Apple follower. And as cliche as it sounds, the leader responsible for all of these devices, of course, Steve Jobs, is who I wanted to focus this project on for obvious reasons. And sometimes leaders of big companies are stoic and boring with traditional stories that are so benign and predictable, they write themselves. Steve Jobs, the late co founder and former CEO of Apple, really has anything but a traditional story. Jobs was born in 1955 and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he was actually adopted by non college educated parents, Paul and Clara Jobs, which is a little known fact about Jobs, and not that that is hugely important or predetermines his fate, but again, it's not something that's widely known about about Jobs. And Jobs showed an interest in computers at an early age, and when he was in high school, he joined a computer club and began working on circuit boards and the components of computers, the inner workings of computers. And since Jobs' parents didn't attend college, they really pushed him to attend. They felt that was something that was very important for him to go on and do. And he did. He enrolled at Reed College, though this is something that I think is pretty widely known publicly that Steve Jobs never finished college. That's a point in his life story that a lot of folks like to talk about. He was only at Reed College for 6 months, though he stayed in the Portland area, which is where Reed is, for about 18 months before he eventually returned to California and started working with Atari, the video game company, in 1974. And at that point, he pulled in an old friend, a familiar name, Steve Wozniak, to work on some projects at Atari with him. And when the two of them started to pull off projects in a matter of days that were taking Atari engineers weeks and in some cases months, Jobs really started to push Wozniak to develop a computer company with him. And in 1976, Apple Computer was born. And a quick side story on how Apple came to be with its name. It's actually a funny story. So Jobs was on a fruit diet at that point in time, and he wanted a name that sounded approachable, something that was friendly. He felt like a lot of people were turned off by technology because by something as simple as the name. So he also wanted something that appeared higher in the phone book than did Atari. Phone books back then were huge points of reference. That's how, of course, you look something up. And so he settled on Apple Computer. It was really that simple. Um, so Apple was born, and Wozniak, by his own admission, was quite shy. And so Jobs became the natural leader. And Jobs was not shy. He was the opposite of shy. Actually, he was crass. He was outspoken. He was extremely difficult to work with at times. That was really well documented. He pushed people to the edge. He was a perfectionist. He had his own ideas of design and function, and they both revolved around one single piece of criteria. and that was simplicity. So he was intuitive, he had romantic ideas about how technology should work and what it should look like. And as Apple began to grow, this was difficult for some of his followers. And by the mid 1980s, this kind of started to come to a head. But also by the mid 1980s, Jobs and Apple had launched a couple of computers, the Apple I and the Apple II. And throughout all of this pushing, the results were wildly successful. The Apple II specifically had been on the market in various models for 16 years and had sold close to 6 million units. So, despite Jobs' style and his leadership approach, he was having, again, wild success with what he was doing. But his brute force management style did come to a head, specifically with a gentleman named Jeff Raskin, who Apple hired to work on a project called the Macintosh, something that I think a lot of us are familiar with. But Jobs pushed him like he had everyone else, though Raskin pushed back. The first person to really ever challenge Jobs, and Raskin actually wound up taking a leave from the company. But before he did that, he wrote an internal memo calling Jobs a dreadful manager and saying that he was impossible to work for. And 3 years later, Apple fired Jobs. Um, and there's some discrepancy onto actually what happened. Jobs claims he was fired. Apple board members at the time claimed that he walked away. But either way, Jobs was using Apple employees to work on side projects, personal side projects. So he was stripped of his executive power and was limited to board only authority. So Jobs left, and Apple really began to fall apart. Their market share fell to about 4%, while their rival Microsoft exploded. And in 1997, Jobs was asked to return to Apple. The company is quoted pretty famously, infamously, saying they needed a zealot to lead the company. And Jobs really returned in true transformative fashion. He called the firing the best thing that could have ever happened to him, giving him the opportunity to enter one of the most creative stages of his entire life. And his return is where his true vision and leadership was really put on full display. So Jobs knew that he needed to make Apple relevant again. And in 1998, he launched the iMac, which is an all-in-one desktop. And Jobs wanted to completely change the desktop computer. And before working on this project, he gathered his team and discussed all the changes to the device that they would be making. It was going to be, of course, all in one. It was going to be translucent. It was not going to have a disk drive. It was going to have a large display. It was going to have built-in speakers and so on. And his team was just instantly defiant and came up with every excuse as to why that this was going to be impossible. And Jobs is famously quoted as saying, "Skate where the puck is going, not where the puck has been," which of course is a nod to the great hockey great Wayne Gretzky. And Apple introduced all of these things, made the iMac, and it went on sale for $1,200, which was pretty steep for a desktop computer at that point in time. And Jobs unveiled the device at his first major public appearance since returning as CEO with Apple in a presentation that would really become a trademark for him personally, as well as for Apple and for product launches. And Jobs showcased the iMac first by describing what current desktops were as clunky, as non-performance driven, as non-personal, all these things that he felt were just not very good. And then he started to set up the iMac, talking about what the future of the desktop was going to look like, and specifically what the iMac was going to do, its capabilities, all of these new and exciting things. And the iMac was sitting on stage, but it was covered with a cloth, and then he ripped the cloth off to thunderous applause, and it was wildly successful. And the iMac sold 278,000 units in its first 6 weeks on sale, and 800,000 by the end of the year. So just a tremendous rebound for Apple and for Steve Jobs. And this is just one comprehensive example of how Jobs used his charisma to build rapport with Apple's consumer base. Similar products like the iPod, the MacBook Air, and of course the iPhone were all presented by Jobs in this type of presentation that modern day was kind of dubbed as the Steve Note, the keynote, but of course the Steve Note, and were just wonderfully received by the public and just have been wildly successful. And simultaneously, Jobs began to recognize the importance of empowering his followers. So this is something that was kind of new as he returned to Apple as CEO. And so each year, he led a retreat called the Top 100. So he identified the top 100 employees at Apple, and he took them on an ideas retreat. And they would toss out hundreds of ideas at this retreat and then narrow that list down to 10. And then from that 10, they would narrow that list down to 3. And those were the 3 things that Jobs and Apple would tackle each year moving forward. And prior to Jobs' leaving, he was very hesitant to really entertain any idea that was not his. So this was really a very good move by Jobs to allow new ideas to come into the fold that were not his. And it truly led to innovative ideas and products for Apple over time. Um, but Jobs never completely lost his brazen style, but he learned to pick and choose his battles. He would still go ballistic on occasion. Uh, when the iCloud launched in 2000, it was not to Jobs' standard. And he called a meeting right after and infamously waltzed into the boardroom and just went nuts and said, "Can anyone tell me what Mobile Me is supposed to do?" It was Mobile Me, that was the name of it before it was the iCloud. And when no one responded, he said, "So why the hell doesn't it? You've all tarnished Apple's reputation." And in front of the audience, Jobs fired the project leader and said that no one would be working on this project, and certainly not something that is textbook leadership. And so he was certainly not a model leader in every case, but his success is truly incredible. Jobs fell ill in 2003 with pancreatic cancer and died in 2011. And when he died, eulogies and articles likened his success with the greatest innovators of the 20th century, likened those of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And Walter Isaacson, who wrote the acclaimed biography on Jobs in 2011, summed him up by saying he was not a model boss or human being tidily packaged for emulation. He was driven by demons, and he could drive those around him to fury and despair. But his personality and passions and products were all interconnected, just as Apple's hardware and software tended to be, as if part of an integrated system. His tale is thus both instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about innovation, character, leadership, and values.